Welcome to Cut to the Chase, where we talk about compelling legal, regulatory, and public interest information and news. Your host is Gregg Goldfarb, an attorney, entrepreneur, investor, and activist.
All right, folks, it's time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. I brought Luke Russell back. I'm not even going to pigeonhole Luke with a title, except now, he's like amazing marketer, podcaster, now filmmaker, and he's doing things that need to be done, starting a movement that I got to tell you, if he gets us off the ground, I'm going to be amazed. And so the two topics, filmmaking and all that, but what we're going to be talking about are two of his, I'm going to call them ventures, Braving Healing, which deals with child sex abuse. Before we got on here, he said there's 40 million survivors. I believe it. I've seen what's going on at the churches and Boy Scouts, institutions. And we're also going to talk about Beautiful Humans, the movement he's trying to start. He has started to help us, the country and the world, divide. We're a lot of division and all that. Luke, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing all right. That's a delightful introduction. Thank you, Greg.
All right, it was off the cuff, but a lot of pressure on me to get that right. All right, so where do you want to start? You want to start with, I reached out to you a couple months ago, and we know each other from like the legal mass tort world. You've done some marketing for me and all that. I said, hey man, I would love to get you back on here and see what's going on in your world. And you surprised me with like all of this new stuff. So what do you want to talk about first?
You know what?
Braving Healing or the Beautiful Humans movement, filmmaking? What are you up to? Take the lead.
Let's actually, I want to take people, because I think there's what's interesting about the work I'm doing. And for people who, I've met so many lawyers over the years who don't want to do the things the way other lawyers do. They're like, I don't want to do TV. I don't want to do billboards. I don't want to have to do this. Like, why? And so for the people who are like, I want to do things differently, my whole story is that. Now, I'm not going to give you a long, I'm not here to give you the whole story of my life. But when I look back 20 years, so I'm 34, which I'm not sure if the fact that I can look back 20 years feels kind of weird. I'm getting used to that. But I look back 21 years ago is when I first really started honing in my writing skills, which is interesting because here I was as a 13-year-old writing outside of school because that's what I loved, among other hobbies. But it's interesting because what I did, I love storytelling and I love communicating ideas. I did both fiction and nonfiction and was published and all kinds of stuff. But so I started this. And I also, at the same time, would write to challenge my peers to live out the values we stated. So this is all going to eventually come full circle to Beautiful Humans, but also from the legal career, I stumbled into this. I never set out to work with lawyers. Ken Hardison and I, he's an attorney with a group. We shared a business consultant 14 years ago. Long story short, I ended up going out and speaking to a group of his lawyers and got sucked into this world. And I fell in love with it because, like, when I first talked to this group, it was a mastermind of PI lawyers, and all I knew was your ambulance chasers. That's the only thing I'd ever heard about. Well, I get in and I start doing research, and I'm like, oh my gosh, these people, like, what I hate is when we judge a group of people with completely inaccurate information. And I had judged PI lawyers, just, oh man, if I just run over and slip on that banana peel, I could get $1 million. And then the hot coffee lawsuit, as if I knew anything about it, even though I'd never done any research, and I started digging in and realizing how this industry is vilified. And I was like, but you're actually the people who are like, hey, like, you harm that person, since you're not going to do anything about it, we're going to try to make you, which, I don't know, sounds really good.
Yeah.
It sounds like a very noble thing to dedicate one's life to. And so I fell in love with that, but pair that with the fact, so I'm autistic. I was diagnosed as autistic this year, which made sense my whole life. And it's part of why I don't see social norms, which leads to a lot of challenges, but it also means I feel very little beholden to the way normal people do it. And so when it comes to this space in marketing, what I love doing is what everybody says you can't do. So at first, everybody's like, you can't use Facebook to get clients. I spent, a decade trying to disprove that. Got clients, honestly, frankly, it was kind of hit and miss. Facebook advertising, did about 30 million on that, but it's a totally different ballgame when you're advertising. But all these different strategies, all these different things, constantly trying to go and and I was constantly reinventing myself, which might look like from the outside, I don't know what I want to do. Well, what I love is innovating. I finally came to terms with that. A friend, everybody claims to be an innovator, and I feel weird saying this on your podcast, Gregg, but I have friends that are like, Luke, by definition, it's just what you do. Like, I look at stuff and go, how can we do something that nobody's doing here? What's missing? What do we? And so, like, I kept innovating and doing all these different things with ads and trying strategies nobody else was really trying. I mean, I was getting mass tort cases in 2013 on Facebook when almost nobody was even trying. And so, but the problem was I got into myself into a business model where everybody just wanted replication of all this stuff, and which is very soul crushing to somebody like me. You know, we had all these clients, some of the biggest firms in the country down to smaller firms. Like, we were working with all these folks. And so because I couldn't, there was ways to innovate, but not the kinds of ways I love. So that's when I launched Lawful Good. And that's Lawful Good was a podcast I did for 2 years. Gregg, when we were really efficient by the end of it, we spent 30 to 40 hours per episode. That was our efficiency. Like, that was, and so it was like, but what I learned in that was I love storytelling. And what I also realized was when you show up and want to tell someone's story in a way that very few people ever have, you build a relationship and an imprint on that person in ways like from a quantity of time is far more efficient. So I love human connection, love it. I think there's nothing more precious in the world. And so, somebody who loves human connection, I also still love my like efficiency brain. I'm over here like, cool, like what kind of, and you can't fully min-max relationships because we're still humans. But what I realized was I would do one podcast interview with one of the nation's biggest attorneys, and all of a sudden now I could text them and they text me back. And I'm like, wait a second. I know people who've tried to do expensive dinners and events and meals and all these things to court these people, and yet they're not interested. And I show up and do a high quality story on who they are, and suddenly now it's not. Now, some people got really deep relationships, some are like surface level, and some probably don't even remember me. But from a standpoint, I was like, wow, this is like really replicable. But the podcast space was just like, we won awards. It was great, but it's a little too limited for me as far as a medium, as far as what I like doing. And then with the ad agency, I was like, I can't do this anymore because it's just soul crushing. There are too many changes with Facebook that was just frustrating. And so I decided to venture out and go help 2 or 3 law firms across the country build relationships with marginalized communities. But I'm bringing all of this background of like, how do we make money in human connection, marketing, understanding of this industry, and of human connection. And so I go out and I help these 2 law firms. One law firm in Florida build a really like did so many inroads with the LGBTQ plus community, and then in Seattle with a variety of communities, but especially the Black community. And in the process, I was like, well, I have a video camera. Let me show up and do some video stuff. And long story short, which I don't know this is a long story, but a little shorter, I did a short film on suicide. And what was wild was, so I have my own background with suicide, and so I'm able to walk into spaces and people trust it. But like, I started asking people like, hey, I'm looking for people because we were putting on a suicide prevention event for this law firm and all these things. And I was like, we'll screen a short film there with all these interviews. Well, I ended up interviewing 13 people. And what was remarkable was I showed up to talk about a suicide, which to me is just a normal topic, but I recognize the world doesn't talk about it. And folk were so appreciative. They shared things that they didn't even share with their friends, which was also something, frankly, in Lawful Good. We had numerous, I think about a third, 25% to 30% of my guests cried. I had numerous lawyers be like, I've never told anybody this out loud before. And like, so I take all that and go into a trauma space where we don't want to talk about suicide. And I would bring up these things, and people like afterwards were so grateful. At coming to the events and seeing this film screen, it was really good, and like people talked about it. That was a little over a year ago. We ended up getting, so for this firm that I was working with, they had a really hot, like a trial lawyer who was not going to go work for anybody, but then because this law firm was showing up and caring about the queer community and suicide, this lawyer was like, you know what, I want to come work for you. Like that right there, that trial lawyer, I'll tell you, like there were numerous firms across the country trying to get this person to come work for them. And they chose this law firm because they cared about suicide. And I was like, wait a second, okay. So when we show up and care, so then I started doing other things in these different communities. And I realized time and time again, when I show up in spaces with film equipment and I say, hey, look, I want to tell your story in a way that really honors you, trust builds rapidly. It can still be broken, but people are suddenly, because I'm showing up doing something nobody else is. Nobody, for the most part, cares that your dad killed himself. I mean, they care. It's like, oh, that's sad. I don't want to feel these feelings. Most people don't want to stop and go, no, we can sit and feel the feels. And not everybody's capable of that. So that has springboarded this whole film career of mine, which is great. For the last 20 years, I've always loved video, just never got really into it. And what I've been seeing is like, so we've done work on substance misuse, suicide, domestic violence, and now we're on this huge sprawling project for child sex abuse. And every single time when we show up to talk about one of these topics that society isn't comfortable talking about, trust and respect is built at a speed I've never witnessed in a replicable fashion. You know, you might have somebody like just click with. That's different. This is like these aren't people that I was at an event. We're like, oh man, I like you. Let's connect. And then we connect really quickly. I'm showing up with people who I say, hey, you're impacted by this topic. Could we film you? And the trust, we sit down, we have good interview prep, we prep the guests with very trauma-informed practices. And so what we're seeing, these people with huge online followings are like, tell me how I can share it. And so it's interesting because my journey is me trying to figure out partly my home in the world, and I've realized film is it. Because it's storytelling, it's all the technology, it's fun, it's emotionally complex, it's cognitively complex, it's extremely intellectually stimulating. But you get to do stuff. You can achieve business objectives, whether it's getting new cases, getting referrals, driving talent acquisition, talent retention. There's so many ways to use film to drive business objectives. It's not just a feel-good process. And so it's just really fun because I get to draw on my marketing background to go like, how do we use this to drive your ROI? Because that's why you're spending a small fortune on it. But then also, how do we go over here and honor people's humanity and truly help them feel seen in the world? So, anyways, I probably just talked for 8 minutes, but that's kind of how we got here, and that's why it fits. It fits me, and I think for lawyers who are like, I want to do something different, this is not a small budget thing. I'm not gonna lie. Like if somebody wanted to hire me, like a full length documentary, 6 figures, like it's not like something that I'd be like, hey, if you got a small practice, do this. But it's something too that you can explore. You're like, man, I love drawing people's stories out. Any lawyer can go and do this. Any team, like if it takes skill, there is a lot of skill in interviewing somebody, as you know quite well. Um, but it's something people can do. They don't have to do on the grand scale that I have. And we're traveling with, tens of thousands of dollars of gear and numerous pieces of luggage. And it's all these like got audio engineers and all this stuff. You don't have to do that. Showing, because I started simpler. And if you look at my first film compared to the beauty of what my current ones are, it's his low quality audio wasn't great, like, but it made the impact. And the beauty, the really nice equipment's great. But at the end of the day, it's like, Greg, can I see your humanity and shine a light on it where you feel truly seen? Not seen for a checkbox or tokenizing, but like, oh my God, we could stop and talk about something that's hard and I'm not being pushed, but I'm being seen. Those relationships, those do drive business objectives.
All right, let me kind of break this down a
Yeah.
little because I want people to know exactly the two topics that we're really talking
Yep.
about. Your two, I guess, projects. I'm going to call them projects. The Braving Healing relates to child sex abuse. The Beautiful Humans is about the divisiveness that we are undergoing, and you're using film to do what a lot of like when I say this generation, I'm kind of I'm referring to like the last 5 years and what COVID and remote working has sort of done. It's taken us all that, and you compound what social media has enabled a lot of the young people to sort of avoid going out and making friends, playing with the neighbors across the street. And so people are learning to live in their house, not going out, not connecting. And so this is causing all this other weirdness out there in the world. And you're basically doing just the opposite. You're going out with your film, with your cameras, you're interviewing the hard topic folk, and you're seeing that they actually are receptive to it.
Oh, and
So
that law firm is behind it. Like people are like, oh my gosh. Like they're like, who's the law firm again? Who are the people? Because like who does that? People are like, is that normal? No.
there are some, we know some.
Yeah.
When we go to Vegas and have our big parties, we see a lot of the do-gooders. We know them. Some of them are there just to make money. Others really do want to help. So it's funny when you say the ambulance chasing. When I got out of law school, I'm like, I'm going to do everything but be an accident guy. Somehow or another, I got some accident cases along the road, but I moved more in the mass tort space. And my goal this year, just this is completely off topic, but my goal this year is I've always wanted to create the tort mobile, sort of like the Batman's mobile, right? So instead of the Batmobile, it's the tort mobile. But what I want to do is show myself that I can use some of this new technology. I'm going to get a 3D printer and I'm going to create the tort mobile. Okay, forget about that right now.
Love that. Love that so much, Greg.
Okay, but you can help me with the design and and
Great.
all. And we can maybe even use that in your all right. So let's first talk about Braving Healing. Exactly what are you doing?
Yeah, so it started as a documentary, which was supposed to be like a 25-minute documentary from how I priced it. I've exceeded what I'm being paid by at least 110% at this point because when I do a project, I tend to go all in. And so we started and we are like, figured we'd have, half a dozen to a dozen people interviewed. We have 23. 23 people we filmed. And so what happened was, so this is also, and so we went out, my partner and I, we went out and we did all these filming. I mean, talk about grueling work. I mean, like literally after some of these interviews, the people leave and I lay on the floor and cry. I mean, like it was
Exhausting.
so heavy, but it's also beautiful because you're like, some of these people no one's really wanted to tell their story before. So it's like, there's like this deep honor, but like, so we left, we were driving back with all our equipment and we're like, all these people aren't going to be in the film. And it's like, it just doesn't feel right to have spent time with these folk and for them to share their trauma with us and then their story not get shared. So we were like, well, went back to the law firm we're working with for the documentary. And I said, I did all this research and I was like, there's not a single platform on the internet that tells the stories of this community. Like there's like not one that's like both men and women, because there's some that are like women only. There's a lot that's women only. And what we know is young boys are molested and abused and raped at unbelievable, like we don't think it happens, but it does. And you know that cases like Boy Scouts. But so we went back and we made up this whole plan. We just started a month ago. We're launching in January. So Braving Healing is both as a platform and as the film. It's all about the messiness of the invisible burden and that healing's not linear. Like, because when we think culturally, we want to tell the stories of survivors of sex assault and sex abuse when like they did it, they made it. It was like the person was abused, but then they went and they got their fill in the blank degree, and now they're a Harvard educated doctor at this fill in the blank world renowned hospital. We want to tell that story because we're comfortable with it. What we don't want to do is tell the story of the person who only acknowledged their abuse at the age of 60. They were sexually abused for 5 years, but only when they're in their 60s are they finally tell a single soul it happened. And they've dealt with drug addiction. Maybe they're still dealing with it. They've not had a great career because the impacts of the trauma have made them not trusting. There's all kinds of issues with authority figures. And so they haven't had a life that we want to put a news story about, and they still have trauma responses constantly that are visible. All the survivors are going to have that, but like we don't want to tell the story. We don't want to tell the story of the 65-year-old man who still wants to die because of the trauma. We don't because it's not comfortable. We want the hero story of like, yeah, they did it. And this creates a variety of problems. One is those wonderful stories of people who made it, per se. What happens when their trauma hits them and they maybe slip back into drug addiction, or they don't show up for an important thing and lose out on their career or their job or something. We don't want to tell those stories because it's not comfortable. We certainly don't want to act like the person who spent 10 years of cocaine addiction is a beautiful person who was traumatized. And then so like there's all these aspects. And so like for us, it was like really important. If we're going to step into this space, we got to be willing to deal with the mess. Like it's not, and yes, so out of the 23 people we filmed, 19 are survivors. 4 are legal experts and therapeutic experts. These people, some of them have careers that you'd be like, oh my gosh, like that's incredible. And then you have other people who
Yeah.
are still struggling and they're in their 50s and 60s and 70s. And what's important about that is showing the true impacts of trauma. And what we so often do culturally is we just want to show the stuff that feels clean and acceptable. And so for us, it's Braving Healing is this space to tell stories, both through the long form documentary and short form documentaries, and more content beyond that, is to show healing's complicated. You're not alone. It's like there's reasons your life is this hard. Like this was like it's not your fault either. So Braving Healing is just this ecosystem where we'll publish a full-length documentary in Q1, late Q1. We'll start publishing short mini documentaries starting in January, where they feature survivor stories, different topics. But it's really a space for survivor stories to be heard and understood in their complexity. It's really important to have a thorough understanding of trauma, because it's because also like for us as the filmmakers, so my partner's a survivor, which is really important for us, like for credibility with the community. But like the content we create has to be very, very precise, because a lot of like documentaries go back and relive these trauma incidents with detail that's triggering for somebody who wasn't sexually abused. And then if you're sexually abused, it's horrifically triggering. And so like for us, it's this like, how do you help people feel seen without being too re-traumatizing? And so it's like this, but anyway, so the platform, it's a space we're also having like all these expert videos where like therapeutic experts, experts on different aspects, but also the legal experts. So that's how the plaintiff's firm is built in, because we're partners on the project, but they get to be, it's a platform where we get to tell survivor stories, but we also get to give people access to resources. And of course, one of those very relevant resources is the civil justice system, because a lot of people who work in these communities aren't even aware of what's an option. So that's what it's also because it's not launched. It's hard to be like, hey, go look at this thing and this is precisely it. But it's just a expansive online film and video platform as a means of both telling stories and amplifying the people who are working to end child sex abuse.
Do you think that the 19 survivors that you interviewed, that the interview process for them was beneficial?
So I know beneficial is a complicated word, Greg, because I know like yes, I will say yes. And I want to elaborate, because when I say yes, the healing journey is hard. So like for instance, we had one person who's never come out publicly about their trauma and their abuse. And before we got to the time of interviewing them, they had actually by this point already shared very in a kind of a squirreled away part of the internet a bit of their history. But it was part of like them being able to, like, our very survivor focused process was able to just help feel a little more okay. And then now they participate in this film, and if they're okay with us using part of their story in the film, this will be the first time they've ever publicly done it. But mind you, most of these people we've talked to, like after their interview, they went home and laid in bed for hours. They had to meet with their therapist. Like we prep people too to make sure, like, do you have a plan? Do you have like, because like there are people, we had one person who almost couldn't come. Like their body was in such a trauma response. They were physically ill, experiencing various physical ailments, which is a very common trauma response. And so like, yes, we've had so many people say they appreciated it. It was helpful. It was important. But I say when I like my caveats, like it just doesn't come at, it comes out with a cost that's hard. Healing through trauma isn't fun. And for some people, telling their story is a part of that like healing journey. So people have been deeply appreciative. We've also gotten very high praise on how we show up from a trauma standpoint. Because like as an interviewer, so my partner Kat, she sits, so and this is actually really valuable when you think about interviewing people. So people don't look at me when I'm filming them. When we're doing film, we have like I'm behind like a camera and a light and stuff so people can't easily see me. But I have my phone out. And I also prep people. I say, hey, look, you're gonna be looking at Cap. She's sitting over in this other seat, and she is a survivor. But her job is to be with you in this and to listen to you. My job is I'm over here, my brain's split in 5 different directions. I'm gonna have my phone out. You're gonna see me scrolling because I have a ton of questions in here. If you see me typing, it's because I'm making notes. And what I'm doing is I'm over here, I'm thinking about all the research we did, all the interviews we've done so far. I'm listening to what you're saying, what questions I think I should be asking, what questions maybe I hadn't thought of before. I'm also trying to follow your energy to figure out where we should go. I'm also thinking like maybe there's things about your lived experience that like I need to make sure I ask about. So I'm over here, I'm with you, but I'm also like you're gonna see me on my phone. If you see me scrolling, I'm not on Facebook or TikTok. I just have my notes open. I show them it. So I'm like, this is what I'm doing. They're like, okay, cool. So then when I'm interviewing, I'm also watching and following their energy. Because I know like there's like as an interviewer, I'm thinking like, man, I really want to be able to ask these questions later. And if their energy is getting to a place where I'm like, I'm not sure if they're okay, or maybe we're going toward that space, I need to pivot. And for one person, the question might be just, oh my gosh, so empowering, like, yes. And that same question for another person might be like, oh, I just brought up horrific memories, or even maybe not memories, but their body reacts. And like with one participant, we stopped in the middle of the interview and did breathing exercises together. Because and I don't know. Look, here's the thing. I said trauma informed, and I want to be clear. We're not technically trauma informed. We are so well researched on various forms of human psychology and human interactions that I'm fairly equipped when it comes to this. And then frankly, it's just shutting my mouth and letting other people tell me things. But there's a lot of humility in the process of going like, I'm asking you about your trauma. So I'm not here to push you. And I also tell people from the outset, I'm like, look, I'm not here to ask you about, like, we're not going back to the incidents. We're not reliving stuff. And so like, some of this, again, all the questions. But so to the original question of you, Greg, yes, we've actually had a lot of really positive feedback directly from people. We've also heard from other people who are like friends of people who participated, like, man, they felt so safe. They felt so good. They were just like, after they got out of the interview, they texted or called me and they were like, that was amazing. But amazing doesn't equate to necessarily fun or feel good. Amazing might be they laid in bed for the rest of the day.
Like
And so anyways, that's a long answer, but it's complicated because we're working in trauma. So it's not like I just want to be clear that it's like people found it valuable, but it's also valuable because of this really delicate process.
All right. Short question. Short answer. The name, have you come up with a name for the documentary? You know, as a podcaster, names, titles, are key. So have you come up with one? And if so, can you share with us? Or
Yeah, it's Braving Healing was the name of the documentary.
that makes sense. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So you're gonna release this in the first quarter of the year. Then you're gonna come up with some more content, short films, also laying out more stories. Are you gonna allow this project to sort of have its own life, or is the project in essence just filming survivors and letting it go?
What do you mean by letting it have its own life?
Well, a project can start like, okay, I'm going to create a documentary about child sex abusers, victims. And I like the topic. I want to run with it. It's getting momentum. Now I did my documentary. Now what? Another documentary? You said you're going to do some more short films. So are you does the project have a life end, or are you going to just roll out more productions and then decide where it goes from there?
Great question. So before I finished the documentary, I already lined up the expansive platform that I was talking about earlier with the monthly short films. We'll be releasing 2 mini documentaries every month starting in January on child sex abuse. So like before we could even before we actually entered post-production, we already had this turning into an expansive project. So it's very much a sprawling project, and I don't envision, like, to me at a certain point, I'm like years down the road as the visionary, I might step out, but I might not. Like, this is something that, like, my partner, this is very much like she's committed to it for the long haul. And so this is going to be a long ongoing process. I also envision, like, because too, like, as we are able to tie the work to more ROI for the law firm, the more they can invest in more, because I have a lot of film ideas. I've got so many ideas that I think would be so powerful just within this one topic. And so it's very much, but right now we're in the process, build up the platform, really tie it all together so that way, because it'll have email marketing, social media, YouTube strategies, like all these. It's a very much multi-platform approach. But it's also heavily relationship driven, where we're engaging with leaders to help get the information out, engaging with leaders to really just tie in these resources. So at the end of the day, because we're doing this for the survivors, but the way we get paid for it is so that one day it can hopefully produce an ROI for the law firm, which makes sense. Like, it's like this is a lot of, like, I'm gonna tell you, they're spending a lot of money, and they believe it's the right thing to do, but I know they can invest even more if we can tie an ROI to it. And that's kind of, for me, like, I'm the, like, let's show there's money in human connection. So I'm kind of this bridge. We have, like, the law firm who values this, they do good, but, you know, it's business. And my partner who's, like, all about, like, she's a survivor and she's all about this community. Then I'm in the middle and I'm like, let me bring it all together so that we can build this long-term space that gets proper funding for the sheer volume of work it is, but also we're truly honoring the community.
All right, nice. All right, now we are going to move
Hold
on.
on.
Oh,
Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
I want to tell you something. You asked about the name. You asked it. You told me it's a short question. Let me give you a little bit more behind it if we have time.
Fine. Yes.
Picking a title for this film was so much work. Like, it was hard. It was just because it's like, one, there's not many films out there actually on this topic, so it wasn't like I was bumping into that. But how do you have something that doesn't feel dark and sad, but also something that's representative? Well, Brene Brown, she's a social science researcher with a specialty on shame. She uses the word braving a lot. And I liked it, but so that's like been kind of introduced into the vernacular of psychology in the last decade, is this more widely used word of braving things. And as we did all this research, I kept coming, like, this, like, braving healing is this idea that it's hard. Like, healing isn't just easy. But so we did all this research and we came to this idea that we're like, we like this one the best. But here's how I decided upon it. We didn't know for sure. When we went out and we started filming, in my questions, I included this whole section. It was like my last section of questions, like, what's it mean to you to be on a healing journey? And then I asked them some other stuff. I was like, what does it mean to you to be brave? And then, what do the words braving healing bring up for you? Out of all the survivors, only 3 were like, nothing. The rest of them all literally opened their mouths and in totally different ways articulated the vision for this film and what it stands for in 17 different ways. And so that's when I knew we had the title. And so that was partly, so it was a combination of, like, market research, all kinds of, like, word association, reading articles on people around healing, braving, and the community at large, picking one, but then working it into the interview process so that then I can be like, does this actually fit? Do people get it? And so that I'm really excited because the title held so much weight in the interviews, and it really resonates with the audience.
Nice. All right. So last question on this topic. Somebody out there might be listening to this podcast and might know of a victim, survivor, and might think that that person, or maybe it's them themselves, would be a great candidate to be interviewed by you. Are you entertaining offers to be interviewees?
So I'm not looking for that. If somebody reaches out to me and is like, hey, I'd love to talk, I'm all ears. There's no reason for me to say no, because it's kind of like, frankly, every person's journey is different. Everybody's experience is different. So if somebody wanted to contact me, I'd absolutely welcome that.
Nice. All right. So that'll do it for part 1.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.